Be honest with me. We say that like it's a mantra. We say it when we're in a new relationship or in a failing relationship. I can handle anything as long as you tell me the truth. I think we mean it. I mean, we're the kind of people that can handle the truth no matter how hard it is, right? But I'm starting to wonder if that's actually true. You know, do we really want the truth, or are we asking for a very specific kind of truth? One that already fits the shape of our comfort, right? I mean, we say we want honesty, but what are we really saying? I think that we're often just looking for confirmation of our own perspective. And when the response we get doesn't mirror our own thoughts, we don't even experience honesty. It feels like a problem. If harmony requires sameness, then you aren't asking for honesty. You're asking for a performance. Hey, lovers. This is Sex in Real Life. Honest conversations about sex and relationships beyond 40. I'm your host, Stacey Herrera. I had a conversation with a childhood friend. This was several years ago. I mean, we've known each other since we were kids, right? I'm talking scraped knees and bicycle tires. And he was talking about something and I didn't agree, you know? And I mean, this was so long ago, but I still remember it because he kept restating his position. He just kept rephrasing it in a slightly different way, like using different metaphors, slowing his speech down. He was talking to me like there was a language barrier. I mean, he was so convinced that all he needed to do was find the right angle, and then I would finally get it and come around. And I kept saying the same thing, like, I'm not confused about what you're saying. I'm disagreeing with what you're saying. And he could not handle that reality, you know? He was so sure that if I understood him perfectly, then that would change my mind. And it didn't, because I wasn't confused. He was doing, what's that quote, insanity is doing the same thing and expecting a different result. I mean, this was essentially that. But he represented a archetype for so many people that I've seen, someone who cannot tolerate not being the North Star, because he assumed that comprehension and agreement were the same thing. Because in his mind, if I really got him, I would naturally, take his side. And yeah, it didn't work because I wasn't confused. He's one of those people who is so adamant about always wanting honesty. But that wasn't what he was looking for. He wasn't looking for an honest exchange. He was looking for a mirror. And I didn't provide that, so he kept trying to polish the glass. So, again, we say we want honesty. And I believe us when we say that. I think it's true. I think we really do. But aren't we lying to ourselves about that? You know, maybe we just haven't fully examined what we're really looking for, what we're asking for. Real honesty is not just a lack of deception. I mean, that's the baseline, but that's just like when you say you're be honest, if all you're really saying is just don't be a liar, that's not the same thing, you know? It just feels like sometimes when people are saying they're seeking the truth, but what they're really looking for is more curated than that. They want the truth as long as it's aligned with what they already recognize. And like this creates this really exhausting cycle. If you need the other person to agree with you in order to feel safe, you are asking them to shrink themselves to fit your narrative. You don't want them to be honest, you just want them to confirm your reality. And when they don't, when they tell you something that doesn't resonate, you might feel betrayed. But what if the real betrayal is telling you what you want to hear? Because if they have to lie to you to keep you comfortable, that means that they are also stealing an opportunity for real connection. But if they're just doing it because that's what you want, then maybe it's you that's stealing the opportunity for real connection, right? Sometimes we ask for honesty and then we punish the other person for giving it to us, which means we're asking to be deceived, right? We're literally saying, like, lying is fine as long as it preserves the peace. And then we get upset when the other person doesn't play their part. Compatibility is not the same thing as agreement, you know? I think that we have been conditioned to think that if two people are right for each other, they should see the world through the same lens. But if you buy into that myth, then honesty that diverges from your own thoughts won't register as a virtue. It'll feel like conflict, right? And then that just means, oh, the other person is difficult or unkind or just not getting it. When in reality, they are just responding instead of confirming. Two different things. I personally have been called intimidating by many people that I've dated called me intimidating. I've had friends and family label me as a know-it-all, or as when I was a younger person, I really didn't understand, the vitriol behind those words. I didn't see myself as aggressive. I thought I was just being clear. But when I got older, I realized that a lot of those people were struggling with my directness. That same friend that I mentioned at the top of the show would probably call me difficult. He would probably describe me as difficult, but then, like, why am I difficult simply because I'm telling the truth? When you are considered an easygoing person, sometimes that just means that you're someone who confirms. That's what people think a lot of the time. They're describing yielding, an adjustment of volume to match what's going on in the room. I've never been good at that. I've never been good at that. I mean, every conversation is risky when you really think about it. I mean, it might go somewhere unexpected, it could change the landscape. And for people who experience harmony as being on the same page, that risk can feel like a threat. But sometimes it's really just an invitation. I mean, like I said, I've been called intimidating, know it all, difficult, bougie, all these things. And all those things are just names we give to people when we confuse directness with aggression or disagreement with disrespect, right? But I'll speak for myself. Like when you're wearing one of those labels, especially when you're younger, you start to wonder if something is wrong with you. Like, what's wrong with me? Like, you start to feel pressured to edit and shrink, because you're really just trying to like find the version of yourself that's palatable enough to be loved, but honest enough to live with. It's very difficult, very confusing. And for me, in the instances where I tried to shrink, where I tried to manage or anticipate responses instead of having, real conversations, I felt icky, you know? I felt icky. As a grown up, I now know that self-abandonment is so much harder to recover from than just someone calling you difficult, you know? When someone calls you a know-it-all, you can walk away with your integrity intact. I mean, I'm not saying it doesn't sting, but when you shrink yourself to keep someone else's peace, you leave behind a piece of your soul, you know? Being honest can feel heavy in a world that prioritizes performance, you know? You are constantly faced with this choice like, do you tell the truth and handle the fallout, or do you edit yourself to keep the peace? But here's the thing. Once you start editing, the relationship changes. Like, you are no longer in an honest conversation. You're now having a managed conversation. And then those relationships where you're managing, feelings that people don't even realize you're managing, it's exhausting. It's draining. It's draining for you and it's draining for them. If you're the honest person, you're slowly disappearing, fading into the background. And the other person isn't even getting to know you. They're just getting this polished, safe version of someone that they think they know, you know? And in the end, nobody's in the room. And that is not intimacy. In order to receive honesty well, you have to surrender the idea that the only path to harmony is being on the same page. And, that's relationship work right there. It isn't about finding someone who sees everything exactly the way you do. That person doesn't exist. And if you think you found them, I promise you that one of y'all is performing because nobody agrees on everything. But, building enough trust that a difference of opinion doesn't have to feel like a threat to the ground you're standing on. Like, that's what's up. Disagreeing and disconnection are two very different things. But if you've never had a relationship that could hold a disagreement without falling apart, you don't even know that yet. To you, every time someone pushes back, it feels like the beginning of the end. And so you avoid the push, you smooth it over, you restate your opinion until the person yields just to stop the noise, right? You call the person who won't yield difficult. And the whole while, you just so sure that you really want honesty. My partner and I, we've been together for many years now, and he had never experienced the kind of transparency that we have before we met. He had just not had that in any of the relationships in his life, romantic and otherwise. And my directness made him uncomfortable. I think it still sometimes makes him uncomfortable. It was like such a shock to his system. But one thing that he came to realize is that also meant that there was no guesswork. He never has to wonder where I stand or what I'm thinking because I'm transparent about it. So now, like, he's grown comfortable with this discomfort. He leans into hard conversations now. And I think that being in a relationship with a direct person has changed who he is. Like, it's revolutionized his life, you know, because now he doesn't have to settle for peace. He doesn't have to shrink. He can just be uncomfortable with difficult conversations and still know that he's okay. Yeah, he tells me that the discomfort of hard, honest conversations are still hard. But like now he knows he can survive, right? And this is what real fulfillment looks like. It doesn't look like agreeing all the time. Yeah. That's a massive shift. And a lot of people won't get there just because we've been trained to believe that, you know, keeping the peace is how you stay lovable. So When you say you want honesty, and I believe that you do, it's worth asking, like, what do you mean by that? Do you want the truth, or do you want the truth that confirms your existing reality? Do you want a partner who tells you exactly what's happening in their heart, or someone who tells you what you need to hear so you can sleep through the night? I mean, there's two different things, two different lives, and only one of them is real. The honest life is harder for facts because it does require you to sit with feelings that don't immediately morph into happily ever after, right? It requires you to hear things that might land a little crooked and stay curious instead of getting defensive. An honest life requires you to trust that the bond you share with your partner is stronger than a difference of opinion. I mean, the alternative is an option. That's one choice. The managed relationship, that curated performance. You could do that, but it's expensive. You pay for it in ways that you don't notice when you're withdrawing, or, the inches of yourself that you give up every single day. And it'll keep running up a tab until one day you realize that you've been lonely for years inside a life that looks fine on the outside. My friend, even after all these years, I'm pretty sure he still thinks I'm difficult, because he may never be able to imagine me seeing the world differently than he does. And I don't care. I mean, we're not the type of friends that talk all the time, but I now know what kind of conversations we can have and what kind we can't have. And that's the kind of clarity that honesty gives you, though. It's uncomfortable, maybe especially when it's uncomfortable. If any of this resonated with you, pass it along to someone who's ready for it, or maybe somebody who's not quite there yet. And if you haven't already and you feel inclined, a rating or a short review genuinely helps more people find these conversations. Next week, we are going deep again. We're going to talk about what happens when reconciliation isn't about repairing the relationship. What if it's just longing for the life you had? I'll see you then. Ciao.